I want to welcome you to our third SAE Live and thank you for making the time to join us today. Please be sure to hit the subscribe button below and turn on notifications so you'll be alerted to future conversations and other great content that's being published by SAE. Ariana is joining us today also from the Ink Factory. She'll be documenting the conversation live with images and text. You'll see her screen pop up periodically throughout the conversation. With that, I want to turn things over to our host today, Grayson Brulte, Innovation Strategist, SAE Partner, and host of the SAE Tomorrow Today podcast. Take it away, Grayson.
Awesome. Thanks for the wonderful introduction, Marcy. Today, I'm really looking forward to this, and I'm honored and proud to introduce my friend David Welch, Detroit Bureau Chief of Bloomberg. David, thank you so much for taking the time out of a busy news day to join us today.
No problem at all. I'm happy to be here. I love chatting about this stuff.
Awesome. To kick off the conversation, will you please kindly share a high-level overview of the mobility markets?
The mobility, well, so give me a specific starter because it's a broad.
Okay,
area.
so let's go into the hottest topic. Let's go into SPACs. Everybody's talking about SPAC attacks.
The SPAC attack, yeah. So look, SPACs have actually been around for a long time. One of them that recently did a deal, I think, had been around for 20 years, just laying dormant. So what a SPAC is, to give everybody a quick overview, special purpose acquisition company. They're blank check companies. Somebody who may or may not have a good reputation for doing deals goes to a bunch of investors, raises money, and takes it public, and they say, trust us, we will buy a good company. That's a great deal for you. And once they do that, they tend to raise more money after they've sort of announced who they're going to buy out. And they plow that money into this company to help them start building whatever it is they're going to build. And it basically takes a private company public in one fell swoop of a transaction, as opposed to the whole filing an S1, doing a road show, getting book runners, having a lead left and lead right bank and 10 other banks to go out and get investors in the whole thing. So it's a very quick way of doing it, some would say, an end run around the whole going public function. And we've seen a bunch of these transactions in the past, let's say 6 or 8 months, largely buying electric vehicle startups. They bought, what do we have? Faraday is one, Fisker, Nikola, ChargePoint is another, Workhorse is another. These are all somewhere in the electric vehicle ecosystem, have been bought up by these blank check companies, and they're now essentially public companies. It's come under some scrutiny because Nikola ended up having accusations from a short seller and also from a report that Bloomberg did that some of their technology early on, before they went public, wasn't necessarily legit. And they've had to defend those accusations. The stock took a big beating. So now people are questioning how much due diligence is really done by the blank check company when they buy these startups and take it public. And I think probably in some cases there's very good due diligence and maybe other cases not, but they're risky plays in any case. And they're also big, they're very popular, these stocks, with retail investors. You find them as frequently purchased on Robinhood.
You wrote a brilliant article in Bloomberg talking about the early days of Nikola and how there was a lot of investor anxiety and a lot of concerns. And Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, came out today and called SPACs a bubble based on somebody's reputation. That there was a lot of concerns early on with Nikola based on the founder's reputation. It goes to a SPAC, and you've been covering this. Where do you think we're going to end up with Nikola?
Yeah, so Nikola's an interesting one. So the problem with Nikola was that the founder, who's now out, Trevor Milton, had made a lot of claims that their technology was great and it was the best fuel cell in the world and so forth. And as it turns out, they don't really have a lot of their own technology. What they do is that they're an integrator, right? They have a truck being made with Iveco in Italy, which is owned by Case New Holland. They have a fuel cell system from Bosch. If they conclude a deal with General Motors, they would use their fuel cell system, and they integrate it into Class 7 and 8 freight trucks, which is, look, by the way, that's a great use for fuel cell technology if you can build a hydrogen infrastructure to fill up the tanks that the fuel cells will use to turn into electricity and drive these trucks, because you can store a lot more of it on board than batteries. They weigh less. Batteries get heavy if you want to put them in a big truck, which means that's less freight. Steve Gursky, who runs the SPAC that bought Nicholas, put it this way, and it was very smart. If you want to haul a truckload of potato chips, you can have an electric truck with battery. If you want to haul a truckload of beer, you would need fuel cells. And look, that's the play. So what everyone was buying into with Nikola was they're going to integrate this and create Class 7 and 8 fuel cell trucks, which nobody else was doing, right? Bosch wasn't going to do it. GM wasn't going to do it. Iveco wasn't going to do it. Hyundai has talked about it. So they really had a business model, a good idea, and Milton had raised a bunch of money, and they had a hot stock, but they didn't really have a lot of their own technology. So GM does a deal where they put no money in whatsoever. They put in some engineering, and they agree to help them build these trucks, and they committed their fuel cells for North America. Actually, basically, it was going to be a GM fuel cell for everywhere except Europe. And that would really get this thing on the road. And now, the deal hasn't closed yet, so there's a lot of speculation as to whether it will. So where do we go with Nikola? So the stock is not quite as hot as it was. It's actually taken a big beating over this. It has bounced back since then. I think a lot does hinge on whether or not they close the GM deal. They don't need to because they still have Bosch as a partner. But I think they need to close the GM deal to give investors confidence to give more money to this company in the future, because if they can't raise money, then how do they build the hydrogen infrastructure? We'll talk about this later in the segment, I'm sure, but there's already, who's going to build the electric charging infrastructure on the U.S. highway system and elsewhere is kind of a hot potato. Everybody wants somebody else to spend that money. And building a hydrogen infrastructure across the U.S. is kind of nowhere. This is Nikola's dream. So if GM doesn't do that deal, I think Nikola's got to do something else to make the story compelling for investors to give it more money to build it out. Otherwise, they're kind of dead in the water with hydrogen, I think. Now, GM has nothing to lose here. The way the deal was structured, GM got the stock for free, basically an 11% stake in the company for giving engineering and technology. So GM doesn't risk any capital. They get all the upside. And the reputational damage, because this has been somewhat of an embarrassing episode for everybody involved, GM sort of already incurred that, right? There are already questions about, you guys didn't do due diligence before all of these things about Trevor Milton's background came out. So, but they still have to close the deal. I've seen all kinds of deals fall apart for many reasons. And so that's where we are. I think if the deal goes through, then they have a good chance here. If not, then they're going to have to go about finding another partner who will help them get their trucks on the road and give the company credibility so they can keep raising money and build that hydrogen network.
I'd like to point out to the audience that earlier in your career, you were on the deals desk and you were chasing deals, so you have a complete wealth of knowledge on deals. So you mentioned hot stocks and the whole Robinhood craze that's been well documented on Bloomberg. And now there's a SPAC ETF trading under SPAK. Does that just inflate this bubble even further now, since there is an ETF and it's approachable at $20+ for retail investors to get in there and get broader exposure to SPACs?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, whenever you have any kind of index fund, you put more money into the system. That was the big deal with everybody waiting to see, if and when Tesla would be brought into the S&P 500, because then a bunch of index funds can start pouring money into it. So yes, it could. And so are we at the peak of the SPAC phenomenon right now? Probably not yet. There's still others being announced there, and look, I know of companies out there who have SPACs knocking on their doors. So there are SPACs that you could probably do a gopher hunt and find a few more that haven't bought anything yet. You have to remember too that a lot of these SPACs have formed in the past 12 months or much more recently, and they typically have 24 months to get a deal done, or they have to give the money back. So they have money and they need to spend it, or at least they have a strong incentive to spend it. So we haven't seen the last of these deals by a long shot. We may see a lot of carnage in the next 12 to 24 months, or maybe further out than that with some of these, but because they're risky. These are basically startups getting a lot of public money a lot faster than they normally would. So there's risk for those investors.
Well, there's risk. There's also whales. Bill Ackman, who you can say, some people said it had the greatest trade of all time. He's got a pretty significant SPAC. He approached Stripe. He approached Airbnb. Smart guy. Does he move all that SPAC capital and try and do a mobility play to catch this wave and then dump it?
I wouldn't see Ackman doing mobility. You never know. I would see him doing more of a pure tech play. The tough part with mobility plays, and some of the smarter SPACs I've talked to in the past couple of weeks are hip to this, and I think Ackman would be too, is a lot of these are placing a bet on one EV company, right? It's Nikola, it's Fisker, it's Workhorse. And if they don't make it, then you're kind of belly up. I liken that part of the SPAC phenomenon to the 1920s. We had something like, I forget the number, it was 60, 70, or 80 automobile startups or companies out there. I mean, there are brands that, if you found some coffee table book on 20s automobiles, it's brands you've never heard of or some you've forgotten about. I mean, there are cool ones like Stutz and stuff like that you know about. Then there was one called Graham. I actually ran into a guy who had a classic Graham at a restaurant not far from my house once, and I'd never heard of Graham before. So there were so many of them. Many of them died or they were merged in, folded in. You're going to see that happen here. Now, you did just see ChargePoint sold to a SPAC. And to me, that was a pretty smart move on their part, because if you're betting that electric mobility is going to take off, then you're betting on ChargePoint, assuming the company succeeds, will succeed no matter who, whether it's Tesla or GM or Volkswagen or Rivian, who sells the electric vehicles. As long as someone's charging a vehicle, ChargePoint makes money off of that. It's an agnostic way to play that space. EVs still need to take off in the amount of time that gives you a good investment return, but at least it's an agnostic bet as opposed to picking one horse. And there aren't as many plays like that as there are pure plays, at least that have been done so far. That could be the next wave, though. So you might see SPACs going after battery companies, components companies that charging and the vehicles themselves rely on. Whatever company is doing something that every electric vehicle needs, you probably start to see that be the next round.
ChargePoint is a brilliant point, and it raises the question of infrastructure spending. Even if they go public through a SPAC, will they have enough capital to build out this charging infrastructure that's needed, or they're going to have to go tap the debt markets or another form of capital to continue to build out their network?
I think at some point they will, but the interesting thing about ChargePoint is that they had just raised a round of funding, I think less than a month before the SPAC deal happened. So they've been steadily raising money and building out that network. And I think you'll see more of that happen. Now, look, the trick for a company like ChargePoint or EVgo or any of the charging network companies is they have to kind of pace their build out with the pace of sales and consumer love and adoption of electric cars. That, if you build too many charging stations, then you spend all this capital and you're not getting a return on it. So they want to try to pace that just right so that they're both getting a return on that investment, but also kind of making chargers present enough where consumers see them around and say, okay, it's okay for me to buy an electric vehicle now because I see chargers and I'm not going to be hung up someplace with no juice and nowhere to plug in.
And that raises the question of range anxiety. Do you think that for a consumer that's going to possibly potentially purchase an electric vehicle, that range anxiety is the top of their concerns?
It's still one of them. There's no question about that. I think it's two things, and some people dispute me on the second one. The first one is range anxiety, and I'll sort of part of that will be what's the edge case for electric vehicles, or the edge cases. We talk about edge cases for autonomy, which is, can you navigate a 5-way intersection in San Francisco? Can your car decide between, the stray dog and the elderly person walking across the street and navigate that? Those are edge cases for autonomy. For electric vehicles, it's, can I take that vehicle on a camping trip and park someplace in the woods all weekend and even use my devices in that car and drive that distance without getting stuck in the woods, nowhere to charge? Can I go on a road trip without having to stop for an hour and charge someplace, or several hours because they don't have fast chargers? So road trip is an edge case for that. So people are going to look at those and say, all right, it's not ready for me yet because I don't see chargers around. The second part of that is, do they see chargers? There are a lot more chargers out there than we know because they're in places that aren't obvious. And that's sort of a driving culture thing. If you have a gas or diesel powered vehicle, you see a filling station on every corner, and you know you're never going to be hung up unless you drive until it goes empty, like Kramer in that Seinfeld episode, and then you're hung up for that reason. But in with electric vehicles, people just don't know where the charging stations are because they're in parking garages. They're in the side lot of some shopping mall or a Target or something like that. It's just not obvious to people, and there is that marketing angle of it that people need to know it's okay. It's also the cultural changes. Like you probably remember this, Grayson, and I forget which generation of iPhone it was. There were a lot of complaints that it didn't hold a charge long enough.
Yes.
This happened at some point when I was in New York covering deals, because I remember I would have days when I was visiting people in the merger and acquisition community all day long. I would leave the office at 8:30, and I wouldn't get back to the office at 5 or 6 because I was just in meetings constantly. And everywhere I went, I would stop and say, hey, I'd even have my charge cord with me. Do you mind if I plug in? I need to, slap a charge on for the 30 minutes I'm sitting here. And you need to look at your car that way instead of I fill up my tank and I don't even think about that again for another 4, 5, 7 days. It's a totally different cultural thing. So now people are going to kind of plan their day. If they need to go grocery shopping, is there a charger there that they can get 20 minutes of juice while they're buying a few things? Can they charge at work? Can they charge at a place where they're on a road trip where they're going to stop for lunch for 30 minutes and you may not get a full charge, but you get enough to get you to your next destination where you can plug in. So it's going to be that cultural thing is more like powering your phone than it is like gassing up your current automobile. So people need to get used to that, and they need to get used to the idea that they're not going to be seeing chargers all over the place, but they are they're gettable. You can get to one.
It's a really good point about the iPhone. I remember that I was at a bar in I think the Lower East Side in Manhattan.
It's always a bar.
And my buddy plugs in the phone, and the bar guy goes nuts. You can't do that. You're going to use the power. But then everybody eventually moved to battery pack. So that was a really big cultural change. When you look at cultural changes around the charging of vehicles, do we see a Walmart? Do we see a Costco put charging in there, since their consumers continue to go into Walmarts, they continue to go into Costco's, to say, okay, you can go into Costco, and let's just use a round number. The average time in Costco is, say, 1 hour. It's plenty of time to fill up. But then on the backside of that, does Costco, with your membership fee, do they bundle in as an additional tier? You can buy the Costco Plus with EV charging included.
Look, we're already seeing a lot of deals like that, right? I just saw one recently where Meijer, which is a big sort of a grocery and, big box chain in Michigan. They just did a deal with somebody to put chargers in some of their stores. Target already has some of those. You're seeing movie theaters do it as well, which is, that's a great place to do it. So you're already seeing places where people park for, what's called at least 20 minutes, and they have a place to charge. Parking garages, sporting event, and other entertainment venues. These are all great places where people are going to be for a couple of hours, and you can really charge up. And look, for years now we've seen them in on-street parking in popular destinations and cities for people to charge up. So you're already seeing that stuff, and then you're getting, somebody, whoever owns that charger is, probably getting a bounty for it. That's the other part that's going to develop, are the relationships behind that charger. In the case of ChargePoint, they don't actually own the chargers. They build them and they sell them, and they kind of supply they run the app and they process the transactions, but somebody else actually owns the charger and they get a piece. So it is, in that sense, an asset-like business model. They own some of the chargers, I think, for their fleet customers, but not for most of their charging network. They also have they have roaming with some other charging suppliers. So again, this is getting more and more like your smartphone business, where they have for chargers that they didn't supply or not on their network. If you're charge point customer, you can roam onto somebody else's. And I'm sure it costs more, and more and more entities behind that charger are collecting money off of it. But that's how this is going to grow out.
That's the early days of the cell phone, when you would get these massive roaming bills, where you would go from the Verizon network to the AT&T network to the T-Mobile network, and you would get stuck with these ginormous bills. And so it's really interesting if you look at mobility compared to the cell phone industry. When in the early days of the cell phone, we started with the Nokia and how they had those really plugs that only worked on the Nokia phones, and then we worked more towards a standardized plug that worked across the board. Mm-hmm. And do you think there's been a lot of research done, and Bloomberg has done a lot of reporting on this, and the terminal has had incredible data on asset-light models and the returns on equity that it's been for return on capital for asset-light models. Do you see more asset-light models, kind of similar to what you talked about with ChargePoint, coming into mobility?
Yeah, sure. Look, if you're going public, if you're owned by a SPAC, if you want to be owned by a SPAC, nobody wants to own anything, right? They all want kind of the Apple model, where somebody else owns the factories that makes the equipment, and you make money off subscription revenue and selling content, right? Because it's asset light. Your biggest assets go up and down the elevator every day in a non-COVID time of year. So yeah, I think we will. And in the case of mobility, let's talk about autonomy for a second. So somebody's going to own the car, mm-hmm. and somebody's going to manage the fleet. Might be the same company, but whoever has the app and has the consumer eyeballs probably won't. They'll get people to use the vehicles. They'll have a brand name. Let's take Uber and Lyft. Do they want to own the cars? They may have to begin with, once the cars are driverless. And maybe Waymo has its own app, and because they have, Google has such amazing reach to consumers and so many, billions of eyeballs. Do they want to own the cars? Probably not. They may have to in the early going, but do they eventually kind of offload that onto some other entity? I could see that happening. But you are going to have someone manage these fleets or own charging stations, whatever hard asset is there, but it may not be the company that faces off with consumers.
And we got a good question here from Courtney I'd like to read to you. She'd like to know if you could speak to the incentives that are needed for gas and electric utility business models to change and move towards an electric future.
Which incentives are we talking about? I mean, for the utilities themselves, it's a little arcane. I mean, I'm not sure what incentives we have out there, because it's like a lot of electric vehicle incentives right now, both for the cars and for the infrastructure themselves. It's kind of a patchwork quilt, right? You have some at the federal level, and that's either been frozen or kind of declined under Trump. And the Trump administration's view has been more to push that to the state level. And then you get to the state level, and Grayson, I know you've dealt with this on a municipal level. You do have states, cities, and regions who want to encourage buying of EVs, installing charging stations, and getting utilities involved on a very local basis. And that I would think the incentives, but the best I can go there is I would think the incentives with the utilities would be to kind of get them to really play a huge role in building out the charging infrastructure, because they've got to have, they've got to run power to these things, and they've got to sell the power, and they're going to play a very big role, or at least they can, in getting that done. I mean, they really have to. If you buy an EV and you want to have a 220 you put in your garage, they have to have a role in that, right? Just hire an electrician. The utilities need to know, because they need to know how much draw is going to be in the neighborhood. If everybody in your neighborhood suddenly bought an EV, I think they're going to have to install more transformer boxes around the neighborhood. So it's got to be pretty well coordinated. And I don't know what the incentives are out there to get all of that done.
You're right about hardening the grid, because that's to me, it's not an incentives problem, it's the hardening the grid. Florida Power and Light, which is owned by Nextera, which is now trying to buy Duke Energy, they're doing all sorts of testing down here in Florida to harden the grid. But if you look out at PPG in California, California is notorious for rolling blackouts. And as you mentioned, when I was in the municipal level, we would run all these scenarios. What if every resident bought a Tesla Model S and plugged it in, and the same time to charge? Could the grid do? And we ran all these scenarios with Con Ed. No, it couldn't hold. And so when did we get to the point where utilities say, okay, we have to focus on hardening the grid if this is where we're going to go? And then from an investor standpoint, does it even make sense for them to harden the grid if EVs are such a small percentage of vehicles that are actually sold today?
Like that is the big tough question. And look, that's the question the charging networks have too. At what rate do you build out? I mean, right now EVs are 1 to 2% of the U.S. market. It's bigger in China because of government incentives to sell the vehicles and for businesses to buy them. And no one has a great forecast on this because the vehicles are expensive, and that is one issue that people kind of forget about when they look at the growth of EVs. Even the cheap ones, like a Chevy Bolt or a Nissan Leaf, after incentives, you're looking at a car that's $35,000 plus, which is about the average price of a vehicle. That's still a lot of money for most people. Most people buy, the used car market is twice the size of the new car market because a lot of people can't afford just your average, Chevy Equinox compact crossover SUV vehicle that's out there for, $33,000 or less. And a lot of the EVs are way more than that. Most of them $40,000 or $50,000 cars are sold by luxury brands. So, what's the growth rate on that? How many people are out there who can buy an expensive vehicle every year? So the prices are, this is all a function of consumer acceptance, charging network being built out, prices of the vehicles coming down, profitability of the vehicles going up because the car companies still want to, they're not in this for altruistic reasons. They need to make money. And they're not going to be putting out cheaper and cheaper vehicles until they can make money on the expensive ones. So there are a lot of factors here that control or block how fast we can get there. And everybody who deals with that infrastructure installation and build out is going to have to watch that closely and kind of figure out how quickly to move. And there's a chicken and egg thing there, right?
There's a total chicken egg, and you're right on the luxury aspect of electric vehicles, where Lucid has the Lucid Air, which is just gorgeous, and I think they did what Tesla never did. And I've said this 100 times, and I'll say it again. They built a beautiful interior with a Tesla interior for a $100,000 car is not a $100,000 interior. When you sit in the Lucid, that's a $100,000 car and a $100,000 interior. With Lucid, though, and they're putting so much time and effort into this, do you think that they'll eventually be able to scale and manufacture this car profitably?
Look, everybody has to, and there has to be a plan to do it. Otherwise, their investors aren't going to sit around and wait forever. They're backed by Saudi money, and those guys are very good at making money. So they are patient investors, though, but they are good at making money. So there's got to be a plan to get there. The other thing too is, the ball and the strike on making money on EVs. I mean, there are many different factors there, but look, the battery is the huge expensive piece. On one hand, about 60% of the cost of the battery are materials, commodities. You're buying nickel, you're buying cobalt, you're in the commodities market. And the more batteries you sell, basic economics dictates, the more expensive that stuff gets. But General Motors and Tesla both told us earlier this year that they're working hard on low cobalt batteries, and that's one of the more expensive elements in the battery. So that comes down, and that's how you get the cost of the battery down. So once you start getting cost of battery down, then companies like Tesla and Lucid can make money. Because look, Tesla's the best barometer we have for this. They sell more of these vehicles than anybody, so they should have the best scale. They command great pricing. The EV business in and of itself doesn't really make money. Even in the quarters where Tesla makes money, they're usually making money because they're selling EV credits to other automakers who don't sell EVs or don't sell enough of them. to offset the regulatory requirements they have. So they're buying EV credits, and that costs them nothing. They don't build EV credits, so that's pure profit for the most part, and they've been able to make money that way. Eventually, they're going to have to make money on the EV business. They're getting closer and closer to it all the time. This is one thing, the short sellers will always point out that Tesla, in any given quarter, only made money because of the EV credits. But years ago, they didn't even make money with that, and they're getting closer and closer. And General Motors has said that they will make money on their electric vehicles. This is a profitable program. So yeah, I think as the entire industry builds more scale, you get closer and closer to profitability.
So as companies move closer and closer to profitability, and Bloomberg has the Bloomberg New Energy division where you do incredible research that you publish on commodities, is cobalt comes from the Congo, and there's a lot of political uncertainty. And then lithium comes from some interesting markets, including China. Do we get to a point where somebody says, I'm not going to drive this vehicle, this is blood cobalt, very similar to blood diamond, since the early adopters of electric vehicles tend to be individuals that are pro-environment? Do you think that comes into a point at some time?
Honestly, probably not. I haven't seen people switch to cubic zirconium engagement rings ever. So the blood diamond issue was very real, but I don't think it had a real crippling or even cramping impact on that industry. And plus, everyone's trying to get the cobalt out. That is one issue, though, with electric vehicles. Is you need things like nickel comes from Russia. Pretty much everything you need for that battery comes from someplace unsavory. You probably don't want to be doing a lot of business with it. For one reason or another, whether it's trade issues with China, political issues with Russia, just all kinds of issues with the Congo and other African countries. We're not buying this stuff from the Canadians, put it that way. So, and also it's all expensive, and a lot of it's someplace else, so you're importing it. So, they're working on batteries that just use less and less of the stuff that's either very price sensitive or just tougher to get.
And we got a great question here, which is interesting, and we're talking about the hostile environments and politics. Can we create in America an EV battery without relying on China for minerals?
Geez, that's a good question. My guess is we can, but can we create enough of them? Are there enough minerals here to do it? And honestly, I don't know. I've wondered that myself, and probably should dig in and research that. I haven't heard of U.S. cobalt mines. I'm sure there's a nickel mine somewhere. I don't think nickel is that rare, but it does seem like Russia's the big source for that. So I don't know. It's a great question. And look, the batteries, all the big battery companies are all Chinese and Korean. And so I have to assume that they've got a combination of the technology and access to the minerals.
Because it'd be interesting to see if there are larger. Tesla's making investments and making batteries, but it'd be interesting to see. Then we have Romeo Power outside of LA that's investing. It'd be interesting to see if that industry, from an investment standpoint, starts to more investment here in the United States to try and figure out battery technology. We have a great question here from Raman V. He says, most innovations have a tipping point prior to mass adoption. What is the tipping point in EV mass adoption? Is it reasonably defined in terms of adoption? Is it based on cost? Is it based on perception? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll give you GM's definition, which is, they basically said that EVs need to get to at least 300 miles of range. And that's minimum. And they're really targeting 400 plus, I think, for a lot of the ones they plan to sell in the next couple of years. And I think they've said $35,000 or less. And I think that's probably a pretty good way to benchmark it. But so, forget about the specifics on their definition. Basically, these vehicles have to be no compromise. So you are looking at the average vehicle right now is actually about $37,000, average new vehicle. So EVs need to be able to sell for around that. And you need to have range that is I think it's got to be not just 300. It's got to be 340, 350. It's got to be close to what you can run on a tank of gas. From start to empty. And then, the third part is, how prevalent are charging stations, fast chargers, let's call it, on the highway and other places, the edge cases part of it. For a lot of people, that won't matter. I mean, some people, I think you will have a lot of families early on who have an EV in one side of the garage and some big gas-powered SUV on the other, where they take to go to grandma's house for the holidays, and they can drive, stop at a gas station, fill up in 5 minutes, get back on the road. It's a big roomy vehicle, and then somebody else is driving that EV around day to day to get to work and wherever, because they're just running about town. And they never really run out of juice in the first place, and they just go back home and charge it up. You'll see a lot of that, I think, to begin with.
That brings up an interesting point of going around town. Do we get to a point where the school buses that take children to school, those become all electric, since they're not running, for most part, they're not running long distances? They're within, I don't know the average distance of a house to a school, but it would seem like they're not very long distances that would fit within the range. Does that market start to evolve?
I think so. Fleets are a great use for electric vehicles because the routes are incredibly predictable, and they're completely predictable, actually. And you're stopping in really, other than take a school bus, for example. You are at some depot where all the buses are in the morning. You charge them up. You get to a school. You drop the kids off. If you had another run to go, you could conceivably even charge at the school for a bit of time. And then you go back to whatever depot until the afternoon when you pick kids up again. Same thing with freight. If it's Amazon trucks or UPS or FedEx, they're at a depot all day. They run a certain route, drop packages off, come back, charge up while the truck is being loaded, and do it again. And it's a relatively fixed or at least predictable route. So yeah, fleet operations are great for this, and I think that's where you're going to see a lot of it early on. And that'll get scaled too.
And we have a great question here from Mariam, and we've talked a lot about the U.S. We've briefly touched on China. She'd like to know, are we seeing different mobility trends in the United States, the EU, the UK, and China? And are you seeing any patterns emerge across those markets, or are those markets developing towards new forms of mobility differently?
So we're talking about new forms of mobility. We're talking about
like electric vehicles, adoption, the embracing eventually of autonomy.
So, well, with EVs, it's the same trend. It's just happening at a different pace. So China was faster because the government has all kinds of incentives to buy them, and the Chinese really want the technology there. And it is the kind of state where the government can basically order something to happen or put out a big blanket policy with incentives, and it just happens. Whereas it is much more fragmented here. We have a federal government that everybody loves to complain about, but it's not really as centralized as a lot of people have you believe, because you have state governments and incentives and laws and regulations, et cetera. Kind of the same thing in Europe as the U.S., and they were behind us. It took them longer to give up the ghost on diesel for a lot of different applications. So it has taken time to really take hold there. It has now, but so if we're behind China, Europe's behind us. Not all European countries, by the way. There's some that have massive adoption of EVs, but again, that's a patchwork as well. So let's say in terms of adoption policy, China probably led this thing. Europe's playing catch up. We kind of are too, and we've sort of done it in fits and starts. The Obama administration was very interested in incentivizing EVs. Biden is as well. If he wins, I think you'll see more action at the federal level. Trump administration is not that interested in it at all. They want to push it to the state level. So for electrification, it's the same trend, just different pace depending on regulation. I think it has captured the imagination of buyers in all those places in the same way. Mobility, when we talk about mobility in terms of ride hailing, ride sharing, autonomy, I think the U.S. probably is the leader there, just because Uber and Lyft became such a phenomenon so fast. And I think the U.S. is the center for the software development of autonomous vehicles between Waymo, Cruise, Argo, Zoox, software centers in Silicon Valley and in Massachusetts and Pittsburgh and Detroit. I think the development is here for autonomy itself. But, and you and I have talked about this many times, autonomy's kind of taken a big step back, or maybe just in a holding pattern while people try to figure out two things. One is the technology ready? Can we put it on roads, and on what basis? What kind of duty can it actually handle? And the second thing is, what's the business model for it? Everybody was thinking RoboTaxi up until maybe 12 or 18 months ago, and now companies, I should say, are leaning toward delivery of goods and freight, which is probably the better way to do it. A couple companies that you and I know are doing RoboTaxi, but I'm talking about Main Mobility and Voyage, simple routes, planned, fixed. Voyage is doing retirement communities, May is doing short urban routes, but they're very predictable. That's kind of similar to delivery of goods in the sense that you have a given route, specialized lanes. You can even have hardware that helps the cars identify at points at which they have to make decisions on the road, and I think that's the way you'll see this develop. But it's really shifted toward goods delivery. The focus. It's all being worked on, but I think we'll see that move faster than moving people around.
You're right about goods, and we'll get into goods here in a second, but I want to point out that when you look at what Oliver and the team at Voyage are doing, they're moving older citizens that have disposable income. And I'm going to go give you another drinking analogy, is that they like to go to cocktail parties. They're older, they're retired, and the Villages is notorious, and there's incredible stories if you Google them. They want to have a good time, and they want something to talk about at a cocktail party or on the golf course, and riding in a self-driving car gives them something to talk about. And they have disposable income, and they're willing to pay for it. And Oliver can expand margins because they're not in a race to zero. You can raise it, where Uber and Lyft, when they eventually go into autonomy, I think it's in a race to zero. And so does robo-taxis in running across dense urban environments even have a business model?
Everybody tells me yes. You and I have questioned this, and we're not alone, by the way. There's the question I've had is, when I talk to executives about this, they say you have to get the price to under $1 per mile. And Uber and Lyft are charging $2 or $3 roughly, depending on where you are and what kind of competition is in the market. And they're not making any money doing it. And they're paying this driver not a lot of money to do it, $8 or $10 an hour, right? Or maybe, is that what it is? Like $10, $12 maybe?
It depends on the state. It depends on the route, but it's definitely sub 15.
So they're not making a lot. Once you have a robo-taxi, there are all these fleet management costs. So I did a story on this a few years ago. Avis and Hertz pay $600, well, what's called $500 or $600 a month per vehicle in maintenance, repairs, fuel, insurance, depreciation, and amortization of those cars. They're not stripped down, they're pretty nice vehicles, but these are still your average run-of-the-mill Nissan Altima, Chevy Equinox, Ford Escape kind of vehicle that they buy for, say, bulk rates, 32,000 maybe, or even less. And the depreciation is way lower than a completely electric autonomous vehicle that somebody's going to buy. So in the early days, you have these massive capital costs that have to be amortized. So the depreciation and amortization will be much bigger. You have to clean the car and monitor the car. If someone lights a cigarette or leaves ketchup on the armrest, the next passenger's not going to get in. So you have to run extra vehicles out there on these routes to make sure that if the first vehicle comes by and it's smelly or dirty, that you have another one that quickly comes by for somebody to get in it, and then you have to clean that vehicle. You have to insure that vehicle. You have to park it. You have to charge it up. So there are a lot of expenses here to this thing. And if the business model is really under $1 per mile, and some people have told me 70 cents or less, and you're really trying to be super cheap, then how do you cover all those costs? I'm not saying it can't be done, but there are big questions on that I have on RoboTaxi in terms of what you can charge, or what they want to charge. My guess is, and you and I've talked about this before too, is it ends up being a kind of a premium business.
Yep.
Where I don't think it'll ever compete with public transit, because the people taking public transit are they're very price sensitive. The ones who aren't will opt for something like this. So it may not be the $4 trillion market where everybody gives up owning a car and everybody gives up the subway and the bus. People who own a car they may not give up owning that car. They may still own the car, but they have money. So they will take this RoboTaxi to work because it's more convenient than parking. And they're willing to pay a little more for it. They don't want to sit on a train with everybody else and do 12 stops before they get to work. But that doesn't mean they're going to pay $5 a mile for this. They may pay $2 or $3, and then these businesses still have to make money, with all their capital costs and maintenance costs based on that. So there are other models that people have talked about, I know, and we're not going to be able to cover them all here, but I think it's going to have to be a premium business, at least in the early going, because the cars themselves will be very expensive.
You're right about a premium business, and there is a consumer that will pay more than $5 a mile. It's just, I truly think that if you're going to Disney World and you can have a branded experience and you can have Mickey Mouse in the vehicle with you, how much is that worth if you flew cross country to take your kids into the park in a completely controlled environment? So I think you're right about premium. I think a lot of that's going to come down to experiences, but that's going to be a very small niche business. But I have a saying that there's riches and niches, and that will do really good for the Disneys of the world. Will do really good for the high-end hotel operators of the world. But I agree with you. I don't think for mass adoption, there's a model there. But so if you go back to that theory of not having a model there, why do you think more companies early on didn't see the opportunity in trucking, since there's such a large opportunity? If you remove the driver and you're running on a limited ODD, there's ways to make money.
That's a good question. So it depends what kind of trucking we're talking about. If you're talking about long haul trucking, I'm not sure everybody really saw the opportunity, partially because think about the players who really started off with autonomy. It was Waymo, and they started off with 2-person passenger pods, and the conversation they had was all about those two things. One was safety, and they were thinking about the many accidents out there on the road that are your average driver, not a guy driving a semi, but your average driver in their car. So that was the beginning of this, was getting the wheel out of the hands of people who are eating or drunk or texting on their cell phone or putting on makeup or lighting a cigarette or whatever it is that they're doing and getting distracted and hitting somebody else. So that was the first thing, was safety. And the big culprit there was not the long haul truck driver. The second thing, I think, particularly with when Google was doing this, was they wanted the data, and they wanted consumer data. And how do you get that? The data that they aren't already getting is the couple hours a day or hour and a half or so that people are in their cars. So those are the two motivations, was safety and getting consumer data. So everybody focused on the consumer, the individual driver. And Waymo did that, and then the automakers chased Waymo into it, and this was their business. Most of them don't sell Class 7 and 8 trucks, so they focused on their customers and their vehicles and the threat to their business, which is someone else comes up with a RoboTaxi and totally displaces them. So they saw an opportunity, but it was also a threat. So everybody focused in that area for that reason. And then I think as software was getting better, as autonomous capabilities were getting better, people started to look at delivering of freight and goods. The other problem, I think, for delivery, and I'm not talking about over long haul trucking. Now we're looking at stuff like Amazon trucks and FedEx and UPS trucks and mail trucks. You still need someone to bring the package up the driveway. So if you have, I guess you can hire somebody and pay them less if they're just sitting around waiting to move a box up top, instead of actually having to be a skilled like Class 3 truck driver or something like that, but probably not much. So if you still have to have a human being doing this, then there is a question of what are you really saving here, other than maybe retirement and healthcare. So I think that was probably an issue as well. But I think if you look at who actually started pushing autonomy, it wasn't anybody in trucking, and it wasn't anybody who even did anything with trucking. The only one who really did, and they weren't necessarily an early player, but Daimler has a big trucking business, and Mercedes was working on some advanced safety features that were sort of pre-autonomy very early on. We're talking late 90s, and they do have a trucking business. But again, they were thinking safety features for luxury drivers who are going to pay a lot of money for every tech gadget in their S-Class. That was the thinking.
And there is the consumer that buys the S-Class or buys the Maybach. But when I look at delivery and the Amazon truck seemingly every day is at my house, or it's the UPS truck or the FedEx truck, how cool would it be when those become all electric and those drivers then go home to their families? This was a great vehicle. I love driving this vehicle. And then they go down to a restaurant, or they go with their friends and they talk about EVs. Do we see that kind of bring up the adoption curve when they're in these vehicles 8-10 hours a day? They're loving them. They're telling people how great EVs are. Does that kind of move sales at all, do you think?
Yeah, I think it will. You look at a lot of the features that became popular over the years. Interestingly, General Motors started a lot of this stuff way before anybody was thinking about it. They had heads-up displays with night vision. They had OnStar that brought telematics stuff into the car, and they were almost too early in a sense with some of these things, and they just didn't catch on. And then later on, you saw brands like really Lexus and Mercedes start to, and for that matter, BMW start to make them really popular. And then everybody started piling in. But there became a point for a lot of these, particularly active safety technologies, where if your car didn't have it, it wasn't as cool of a luxury car as the person, your neighbor whose Mercedes did have adaptive cruise control or something like that. And I think that will be true with self-driving. Give GM credit for Super Cruise. That's a pretty popular feature now, and I think GM makes pretty good money off of it. And that's one thing that really could help Cadillac as they try to kind of put some luster back on this brand. Is it's not autonomy, but it's, I like to call it semi-autonomy. Everybody else likes to call it level 2 or whatever it is. But it's a pretty cool feature, probably fun to play with. I personally am not a huge fan of these like driving with these autonomous features where you still have to pay attention. If I'm going to pay attention, I'm just going to keep my hands on the wheel and pay attention. If the car could truly drive itself and I could totally disengage and do something else entirely, I would. I don't understand the thing in between, but that's me. A lot of people do like it. And you're seeing all the brands, really, the luxury brands, roll out stuff like that. But that's sort of like Super Cruise, like Tesla's Autopilot, et cetera. And you'll see all of this stuff, I think, kind of go that way. Now, look, a truly self-driving car that starts off in luxury, where if you have an M5 and you want to kind of drive like a maniac on a track someplace and have a great time, you can. But then if you're stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic someplace where it's completely miserable to be driving that car and you can disengage and let the car handle it, I think that's a great feature people are going to want.
It's a great feature. And as we look to wrap up this incredible conversation, I'd like to ask you this one question that you've covered in Bloomberg on pretty in depth. Is Jim Farley the right guy at the right time to rescue Ford? What's the one thing you would change question that he's asking everyone is absolutely brilliant. Thoughts?
Look, that is his question of everybody he talks to. That is really great. And particularly at the car companies where these are 100-year-old companies with very hidebound cultures that, and they've been very top-down over the years, and it's often been difficult for people deep down in to really create change and see bad habits and try to break them because that's the way they've always done it, and the person above them didn't listen. I've heard these stories from people I know who worked at the car companies for years. And this takes me back to a conversation I had with Ron Bloom, who was on the auto task force. I asked him if they needed to kind of broom out everybody at General Motors for a new management team. And Ron had worked restructuring the steel industry He said, Nucor, which was the mini mill company, was actually had gotten its momentum with a bunch of ex-big steel guys who just didn't like the way things were done at their old company. So there are a lot of voices like that in companies, and Farley is trying to unlock it. And there's a lot of criticism of Farley out there as well. I give the guy a pretty good chance here because he seems to be approaching this with an open mind. He was running their advanced mobility side of the business before he became CEO, so he embraces Argo and the autonomy business that they're trying to build. He embraces electrification, and that's what the Mach-E brand is all about. And he understands marketing and brand. He's all about hero brands, and Mustang is one. I think, Ford F-Series and the Mach-E brands, these are really recognizable brands, and he understands that you have to build things around a few core brands that are well understood and generate excitement. So there's some stuff to like in the early go.
You're right about brands, and he's got that track record from Lexus of what he did at that brand. So it's going to be really exciting to see what happens at Ford. And David, I can't thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule on an extremely busy news day to join us here on SAE Live. And thank you to all of our listeners, and thank you for your questions, and thank you for attending. And if you've enjoyed this conversation and you'd like to hear more conversations, please subscribe to the SAE Tomorrow Today podcast on your favorite platform. And thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you on the next SAE Live.